So good morning, everyone. We are in the process of letting everyone in. Amanda, if you could just let us know when the waiting room is empty, and Darcy, if you can let us know if you think everyone is here or if there are people that we should wait for, then that would be really helpful.
It looks like, excuse me, it looks like we have a good showing of health centers. Just scanning here, I would say we've got the majority represented. So I think we're in good stead from that perspective.
And the waiting room's empty at this time.
Great, terrific. And thank you all. Sorry for the brief delay. Amanda, if you could put the slides up, that would be helpful. And then when we do intros, we may take them back down. Actually, let's go. I'd like to go through the agenda, then we can introduce our work group.
Okay.
I'll introduce myself. I'm Jenny Patterson. I'm the Maine Care Director of Policy. And actually, this is the first meeting that I have attended for this particular rate study and work. But I'm the executive sponsor, so you've seen me on emails. And so I'm happy to be here today. And I think, yeah, if you could put up the agenda slide, Amanda, that would be great.
Almost there. It's just being slow for some reason.
I do see it.
Okay, good.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the main focus of substantive conversation today is the change in scope. And so we intend to talk about kind of the outline of the approach that the department plans to take. But first, we want to introduce our work group, to talk about our overall intent of the process, to talk about our timeline, and we will have Guidehouse give a bit of preliminary information on what they're seeing in the supplemental cost reports and just check in on the status of the data receipt, and then we will turn to the change in scope. So next slide. So here are the folks that are on. Again, I'm Jennifer Patterson. I'm the Director of Policy for Maine Care. Folks probably know each other, but if the Maine Care folks could introduce themselves. And again, just to point out, this is overall kind of a new enterprise for us, in that, as folks know, we have a new and exciting rate system reform law that we are in the process of implementing, and it requires the policy and rate setting teams to work together in new ways, which we are doing in this and other rate setting work. And so we are working as a team, as you see from that list. So David, I think David Jorgensen is on, although he's not on the slide. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, I am David Jorgensen, Director of Data Analytics and Rate Setting for Maine Care.
Great. And Peter?
Peter Kraut, Rate Reform Manager.
And Brian?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Limbra. I work on the rate reform team as a rate reform analyst.
Great, thank you. Amanda?
Good morning. I am Amanda Lee, the rate setting coordinator for the rate setting unit, also under rate reform.
Great. And Grace?
I am Grace Williams. I work for the rate setting operations team as a financial analyst.
Great. Thank you, Grace. And Kristen?
Good morning, everyone. I am Kristen Merrill. I am the State Plan and Policy Development Manager for the Office of Maine Care Services.
Great. Thank you. And Kathy?
Good morning, I am Kathy and I am the policy writer.
Great, thank you. And Shannon, is Shannon on? Shannon is the provider relations representative for FQHCs. Is there anyone else from Maine Care that hasn't introduced themselves? Okay, why don't we move to Guidehouse, and then Darcy, if folks want to introduce themselves from the FQHCs, it's helpful to me since I have not participated previously in these meetings. So Guidehouse, David, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and your team?
Sure. My name is David Garbarino. I'm the overall engagement director on this project with MaineCare. Holly.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Holly McDonald, and I have been assisting, especially with the policy part of this project. Nice to meet you.
Josh.
Hi, my name is Josh Middle, working for Guidehouse. I'm formerly a rate setter, so happy to be here.
And then Sean.
Hi, I'm Sean Clare, also from Guidehouse, assisting on the analytics side of this project.
Great, thank you. David, is there anyone else on your team?
Nope, this is the Guidehouse team.
Okay, great. Darcy, I don't know if FQATs would like to introduce themselves. You're welcome to if you'd like to.
Well, we have quite a few individual health centers, so I'm not quite sure how to facilitate that because there's many, but I will say that the MPCA does have a team here that consists of our policy folks as well as our value-based pay program manager, Sharon, who is our director of operations and supports a big data related project or program that we have at the PCA. And then we have our chief program officer here, and I'm not sure if I missed anyone, but it looks like we also have roughly, like, I would say 2/3 just scanning here of the health centers represented by predominantly CEOs of those health centers. So Jen, I don't know if you want to go through and call folks to introduce
Probably
them.
not, but that's really helpful to me since it's my first meeting. So welcome. Sure. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to go over the overall scope of this process. And again, given that our rate system reform is new, this is kind of an integration of PL 2021 Chapter 747 with that rate setting process. But our objectives are really threefold: to obtain necessary costs and all related visits in order to calculate each FQHC's rebased T1015 rate, where the new T1015 rate will be based on total applicable costs divided by total applicable visits. And we also are aiming to obtain data at a level of granularity that will enable us to submit a state plan amendment that addresses past ambiguity regarding which services and costs should be included and billed under the T1015 and which should be billed separately from the T1015. And our goal is clarity and consistency moving forward. So we're excited about that process. And then in addition, the statute talked about updates in the change in scope process. And so that's what we're planning to talk about specifically today, but it is also part of our process. Next slide, please. So our target timeline, as we have expressed previously and in a number of emails, we have an extremely aggressive timeline, and it is based on the dates in the statute, and specifically the March 1st effective date for the new rates. We are endeavoring diligently to meet those dates. And this time frame is one that would enable us to do so. It is aggressive though, and we selected our initial timeline based on the premise that we would receive all of the cost reports by December 23rd. We are very close to having all of the data at this point, which is really wonderful. But we do need, Guidehouse will need the time to work through their analysis. So we hope to meet this timeline, but just want to recognize that it is aggressive. So we're meeting today. We have a meeting already scheduled for February 1st, and that is the meeting at which we will have the public comment meeting where we present the FQHC rates. As has been set forth in an email previously, we want there to be a 2-week public comment deadline in the rate process. So February 15th would be when public comments would be due. Our drop dead date, if we do want to have a March 1st effective date for our state plan methodology notice, is February 28th. So this is why we are continuing to move forward as expeditiously as we can. And so assuming that we're able to meet that date, then the rates would be effective for March 1st. The SPA would need to be submitted to CMS by the end of the quarter or March 31st. And just to be clear, there would be additional steps after March. The rates would need to be loaded into the system. And in addition, we are planning on doing rulemaking, and specifically for the change in scope changes, those really do require rulemaking. So that can be a process that lasts up to 6 months. So the change in scope changes won't immediately be in effect, but we are trying to do everything we can to meet the target for the rates to be in effect for March 1. So next slide, please. So we just wanted to do a little check-in from Guidehouse on where we are in terms of receiving the supplemental cost reports. So I will turn it over, I believe, to Sean to give an update on that. And again, these slides mainly are illustrations of the type of analysis that Guidehouse will be performing with the data. I would not take anything on these slides as final because it isn't, but it's illustrative of the type of work that they are doing with the data. So Sean, is that you?
That is, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if we can go ahead and move to the next slide. So this is, again, just a high-level look at some of the data that you submitted on the supplemental cost report. Thank you to everybody for also responding to our questions as we've sent them to clarify this data. Right now, we have received 17 and have 2 outstanding supplemental cost reports, 16 of which will be represented in the data that follows. 1 is still in process. Next slide, please. So we've at least initially bucketed the services that are being offered into a series of buckets. And again, this is to understand what the industry as a whole looks like, what you are providing to your clients. This is just an idea of how many facilities are billing within each of these particular buckets of data. So we have an idea, again, just understanding the layout of the total FQHC service map. Next slide. So this pie chart shows something else we're seeing in the same buckets and the same data, which is a good spread of what's being actually billed, the volume of charges that are being billed to the universe. And again, this is just to understand and validate your data. It's been really helpful in getting a good view of what's going on and informing the state's policymaking. Next slide, please. And looking at the dental category in particular, which makes up approximately 10% of total volume. But this just gives an idea of something that the state might want to know is how these charges are being billed over the different categories. You know, what's being billed under the T1015 currently and what's being billed elsewhere. I will take a brief moment for questions.
John, this is Sharon from PCA. I'm wondering who's not included in.
Currently, Pines is not included, and that's just because their data is still being processed.
I mean, why are there not 20 total?
I have a list of 19 different facilities, 17 of which we've actually received data from, 2 of which I understand there's some back and forth getting those completed.
And Sharon, the 20th is Maine Migrant.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Peter.
So they're just not included.
Thank you.
And again, this is high level. This is still subject to change as we continue to validate through the data. But again, thank you for answering the questions that we've sent. We really appreciate it.
Great, thank you, Sean. So let's move on to the change in scope, and we can all, circle back at the end if there is additional, people think of additional questions about the process of submitting the cost data. So next slide, please. And next slide, please. So the statute has some pretty specific language about change in scope. Basically, it requires the department to adjust rates to reflect changes in the cost of providing services when an FQHC establishes that it has experienced a material change in either type, intensity, duration, or amount of services provided, or characteristics of population receiving a service that affect the cost of the service. The statute also requires that the adjustment reflect cost incurred retroactive to the date the department received the FQHC request for adjustment, unless the change in scope is due to events beyond the control of the FQHC, in which case it's retroactive to either the date the FQHC incurred the cost or 1 year prior to the request, whichever is more recent. And so in looking at these provisions, again, as I mentioned up front, this requires a change in rulemaking. So our intent in presenting kind of our approach today is to get feedback through kind of the informal stakeholder process prior to formal rulemaking. This, we view it, although Guidehouse has been working with us, Guidehouse did some research on change in scope, and SPAs in other states, and our proposed approach reflects that. But we don't intend to include it as part of the rate. It's a little bit separate from the rate. So just to be clear on the process, we're very interested in thoughts. There will be obviously opportunity through formal rulemaking when we do propose the final change in scope provisions. So as of right now, we're looking for feedback, not necessarily today, but could be after, kind of parallel with the rate process. Okay, so next slide. So here is the approach that we're thinking of taking. And I think we're seeing this as an opportunity to clarify existing language in the rule, which I think has been confusing over time. So our approach would have to qualify for rate adjustment in a change in the scope of services would need to meet all of the following requirements. There would need to be an increase or decrease in cost that is attributable to a change in the type, intensity, duration, or amount of FQHC services or any combination thereof. The reported cost would need to adhere to the reasonable cost principles in the CFR, and the net change would need to equal or exceed a minimum threshold of 3%. And this, I think, is our way of embodying what the statute says about having it be a material change. And so looking at what other states do, many states do have minimum thresholds, and many are higher minimum thresholds than 3%. So we felt that 3% was a reasonable approach. We also would clarify in the rule that there are certain changes that don't constitute a change in the scope of services, because they really are not a change in the type, intensity, duration, or amount of services. And so those include a change in the cost of providing an existing service, a change of ownership, a change in status between freestanding and provider-based, a change in office hours, or an increase or decrease in the number of encounters.
Jen,
next slide.
Jenny, this is Sharon. Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure. Yep.
I have two really under the categories of do not constitute a change. And so in particular, I'm thinking about an increase or decrease in the number of encounters, which, and maybe there's a way to write it in a different way that makes it fall under one of the categories above. In particular, maybe if you think about change in duration. So it's very, very common for a decrease in the number of encounters under a service when the method of delivery of that service changes. So it becomes more of maybe a care team approach to providing a service, right? And so now the visit time is longer, and so then there are less encounters. But I'm guessing that would fall under either a change in duration or a change in intensity, and so therefore still qualify.
I think that's a really good question, Sharon. And I think we didn't share draft policy language because we're still working on it, but the draft that we have does make clear that sometimes those listed as not constituting a change in services may occur in conjunction with a change that does qualify. So, I mean,
I'm also wondering about the change in the cost providing an existing service. And that's just simply become really obvious for our health centers when it's come to recruiting vacant positions and the new sort of increased salary and benefit package demands, which have made the cost of providing many services higher than they were when they originally were requested.
It's a good question as well. I think that separate from change in scope, the department is really working to make sure that our rates are sufficient to cover the cost of providing services. And so I think that's why it's kind of a separate process. And as you know, as part of the rate system reform, we do have COLAs, we do have a number of ways that we are working to make sure that we are covering costs, but it's just distinct from the change in scope process.
I just wanted to make sure.
So this is Craig Hostetler, and I'm a consultant working with the Maine Primary Care Association, and have worked with a number of states that have looked at change in scope and APMs for FQHCs. And I'm curious about the 3% threshold, because the way that's handled in states obviously varies. If you're looking at a 3% threshold to the overall rate and you're changing the duration of one type of service, it's a pretty big hill to climb to get over pushing the entire rate based on one service above the 3% threshold. So I'm curious, do you look at changes over time? Some states look at multiple years and allow for the accrual of several change in scopes to be applied for at the same time to cross that 3% threshold. What's your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We do have a slide later addressing this. And so we are thinking that we will add to the rule of provision that does allow a facility to bundle a number of changes together if they, in order to meet the 3% threshold. There's certain time limitations. I think, I can't remember exactly what we were thinking. It's over a couple year period, but I think we do recognize that sometimes there may be a number of changes that together would meet that threshold.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Next slide. So this speaks to the process that we're looking at. And one key provision that we think is really important is that the FQHC, and again, I think it's consistent with the statute, is really responsible for making the showing up front that the standard is met. And so we would be requiring that the FQHC supply at least 6 months of actual cost data, as well as a narrative describing the change and why it meets the standard. And we really see this as an opportunity to add specificity and clarity to the process so that FQHCs know exactly what needs to be submitted. And so the request would be considered complete upon filing of all application materials, including at least 6 months of actual cost data. And then the department would have 60 days of receiving a complete application to render a decision. So I think, again, this is an effort to just have there be clarity about what the process is, how long the department has to respond, and what the FQHC needs to submit.
Peter, this is Sharon. I wonder if I could ask you a quick question about this in terms of handling requests. Is it reasonable for then an FQHC to apply for a change in scope at the onset of a new service or something that would qualify for a change in scope and provide the data 6 months later so that the rate would actually go back to when they started the new service? Or will they be responsible for funding the first 6 months of any change on their own without any reflection in the main care rate?
Yep, I think I heard most of your question, Sharon. There's a little bit of interference. But I think the question was, would it be possible to file the application first and the data afterwards? And I think that from a main care perspective, in terms of having a process that works clearly and is able to progress expeditiously, it is important for us to have the data before we make a determination or try to evaluate or act on it. And so that's why we are taking that approach, that a complete application does include the actual cost data, recognizing, and our draft does, of course, comport with the language of the legislation. If it's a change that's outside the control of the FQHC, it may go back farther retroactively, but at least for a planned change, this is how the process would work. Next slide, please. So again, this is a slide that speaks to what I just said. So the change would be retroactive to the date that the department received a complete application, unless the department determines that the change in scope was due to conditions or events that were beyond the control of the FQHC. So that's consistent with the statutory language. Next slide, please. So this presents the calculation method. I am probably not the best person to present this slide because I have not been involved, but I guess my point is we want to have the calculation methodology clearly laid out in the rule so that process is clear. So I don't know if another member of the team would like to speak briefly to this slide and what the method would look like.
I have nothing to add at this time, Jenny. Just, yeah, I agree that, not having the calculation method in the rule just, leaves room for ambiguity, and better just to have the method spelled out so everybody knows what it is.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Next slide. So this speaks to the question that was asked earlier about combining changes. So basically, the combined application would look back over a 3-year period, and there could be a consolidated application for changes that occurred during that time period. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, we will need to do rulemaking to make these changes. So there will be formal notice and comment. These changes will not take effect until the final rule is adopted. So really what we're seeking today is, and kind of over the next few weeks before we propose the rule, is just feedback, thoughts, questions, so we can get your input before we are in the formal rulemaking process and unable to have a more direct conversation. So next slide, please. So next is discussion. Let's go on to the final slide. So the contact person for questions or comments about the change in scope process specifically is Kathy Coolidge. Kathy is our policy writer for the FQHC section of policy. So that is the end of our slide deck. So I think we can stop sharing the slides, that we can go back to them if anybody has questions about a particular slide. But unless anybody else from the main care team has anything to add, I think we're open to discussion or questions about what we've presented. If there are further questions about the timing of receipt of the data, we could address those. But anything anyone from main care has to add? So, and again, I want to thank everyone for submitting the data that we have received. I think we are close to having what we need. And so that's why we do think it's possible to meet a very tight time frame. It will be a stretch, but we do think that we can make it, assuming that we get the remaining portions of the data expeditiously. We should be able to share the slides. I don't know, Peter or Amanda.
Yeah, we will post the video. And then once we have the link, we will send that out to everybody with the presentation.
And I'm just looking quickly at the comments.
I'm also more than willing to forward slides to the FQHCs if someone wants to send the deck to me.
Yeah, and that's how we would do it, just like we have in the past. We'd send the slide deck to MPCA and then MPCA would forward it. And I would just stress that the 2 FQHCs that we're still waiting for data from, please get that to us. We really can't stress our need to have that data enough.
And just to underscore what Darcy and Sharon said in the comments, we really do want input from the FQHCs on the proposed change in scope approach. So whatever input you have, if you could submit it to Kathy, that would be really helpful. We want to be thoughtful about how we're moving forward with this and really to have this opportunity to have a conversation before we're engaged in formal rulemaking.
Jennifer, to that point, could you just reiterate the next steps in this process relative to the policy? It's my understanding that there is, that there will be formal policy proposed. I think I remember by February 1 or thereabouts, and then we have roughly a 2-week period to comment on that. Is that correct?
So there's 2 distinct processes going on here. So thank you for asking the question, because we're still learning ourselves how the rulemaking and the kind of rate determination process work together. So the slides at the beginning were about the rate determination process. So the rate determination process, we will have the meeting on February 1st. We'll present the rates. That won't really pertain to the change in scope. It'll really be just on the rates and the rate model. And we'll take public comment for 2 weeks, and then we will come up with the final approach, which will be reflected in our filing with CMS. And so then at that point, our next step will be to do a formal rulemaking, and the rulemaking will include the new rates, and it will also include the change in scope. So that will be the standard notice and comment map of rulemaking. And that's an additional step after the rate determination process. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you for clarifying.
Yep.
One thing I would add to that, and Jenny and Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, is the SPA notice, which we need to file February 28th in order to have the 3/1 effective date for the rates. The SPA notice will also need to include something about the change in scope, because change in scope has to be part of the SPA, and we're not going to be doing 2 separate SPAs, one for the rates and one for the change in scope. So even though the rulemaking won't start until later, we still need to have the change in scope proposal sufficiently finalized so that it can be included in the February 28th SPA notice.
I think that in an ideal world, yes. I think that's dependent on the feedback we receive from the health centers. We may end up needing to do a secondary notice for the state plan. And if that's the case, because we receive a lot of feedback, that's okay. It'd be a little additional work for the department, but it's not problematic.
I have a hand up, although it maybe went down. I don't know if the person put the question in the chat. I think it was the same person. So would you please speak to the department's obligation to respond to requests for CIS in a timely manner? this is part of what we are really looking forward to, having the opportunity to have clarity in that process. And so to have it be absolutely clear what constitutes a complete application, to have it be clear that the department will not act on an application other than acknowledging receipt until it is complete. And so we do want to have some clear timelines. We're contemplating that it'll be the 60 days of a complete application, and that will be clearer than it has been in the past. But that's a helpful comment. So if there are things that FQHCs want to point out that would be helpful to improve just the clarity of the change in scope process, we're happy to get those comments as well. Does that answer the question? Great, thank you. So if there's no further questions, I think we can close the meeting. Our next steps are that we will get the slide deck out. Guidehouse will continue to work with the FQHCs on the remaining data. Oh, I see one more question. Historically, did the request of change in scope meet the 3% threshold, or are they above or below? Peter, do you have any anecdotal knowledge of that?
Yes, the vast majority meet it.
Hey, Peter, this is Bobby. Quick question. Bobby from the PCA. Can you confirm that the two CHCs that you're still collecting data from are fully aware of who they are and what data they need? Just, I know there was some confusion over submissions last week.
They should be aware. I mean, one of them, the last we heard from them was that they were working, well, we heard from Sharon that Sharon was working with them. And then the other one, you know, Guidehouse has written back to them to let them know that the file that they had sent was corrupted, and wasn't able to be opened. And Guidehouse replied to them saying, hey, can you please send it again, because the file they sent isn't workable. So, I mean, I suppose we could send up follow-up emails. I don't think we have contact info for the one that Sharon's working with. But we could take this offline, and you know, we could email Darcy and Sharon and Guidehouse just to make sure everybody's on the same page and get the contact info and make sure that those health centers know that they are still on the hook.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. Oh, and Lori, to reply to your last comment, those are two different things. The 3% is a threshold for applying. You know, and as Jenny mentioned in response to Craig's question, you know, we allow the batching of projects over a total of 3 years to hit that 3%. The 5% that you're referring to is about something different. The 5% in the current rule is about if an application if a change in scope resulted in a change that exceeded 5%, the department could request data to redo the rate change. So that's what that 5% is. And it's really a very, very different thing than the 3%.
So I'm just looking to see if there's any more comments or raised hands. I'm not seeing any. So thank you, everyone. Oh, Charlie, yes, go ahead. Charlie, I am not hearing you. I don't know if you're trying to unmute. You look like you're unmuted, but I don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you. Sorry to squeeze in at the last minute, but as I've been thinking about this, this proposed 3% and the 3-year accumulation, I just wanted to add the comment that my sense of, sort of part of the impetus for rebasing was a history that's very difficult to reconstruct over 20 years, but that basically you have the phenomenon that changes that don't accumulate to big enough ones to get a change in scope adjustment together, or anecdotally, there were periods of time when the department was discouraging those applications. So you have missing costs that you never catch up to, and hence the reason for the rebased APM. And I wonder whether the department might think about whether that 3-year limit on accumulating change in scope to 3% would cause that to recur so that you end up falling behind over time.
It's a good question. I think our hope is that that won't happen, and that the reason it won't happen is because as we move forward with our rate system reform, we will be much more systematic in updating actual costs, and that will be distinct from the change in scope process, and also kind of having there be additional clarity on the change in scope process hopefully will help FQHCs know like when they should apply, when they shouldn't apply, and we will expeditiously act on the applications that we get. So our hope is that that won't be a problem going forward, but certainly we want to avoid past problems.
Well, and I think, Jennifer, my thought here is that, LD 1867 and the sort of process that you are looking at across all providers contemplates regular rebasing, which makes sense across all providers. But we have the overlay of the federal system here such that, we're not even sure rebasing is the right term, although it's the term that's used in the statute and that makes sense to all of us conceptually. But I guess my point is that we have to look at that PPS process, and it's always an APM for the FQHCs if you rebase, which seems to me to make an argument for wanting the change in scope, which is a federally recognized piece of the puzzle, to function as well as it can to keep costs up to date. And I don't expect us to, solve that problem today, but I just think it's worth thinking about as we go forward with this.
Absolutely. Thank you. Just hang on a little longer in case anybody thinks of something, but we will all be together again on February 1st. So that is not so far off. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, OMS folks. Thank you, FQHCs. And we will see you again on February 1st.
Jenny.
Thank you all.